The arrogant Mafia boss swaggered into the café like he owned the street, laughing, flashing money, and making sure everyone noticed. Spotting the quiet nurse in scrubs, he decided she'd be an easy target, someone to belittle for sport. With a smirk, he leaned in, mocking her job, her silence, her small presence, turning the room into his stage. She didn't flinch. She set her cup down, straightened her shoulders, and looked up with calm eyes that had measured distance, timing, and pressure for years. The hands he expected to tremble had wrapped bruised knuckles, taped wrists, and drilled footwork until the world narrowed to breath and balance. She answered softly, yet every word landed like a bell at the start of a round. Conversations faded. His grin faltered, because intimidation only works on the unprepared, and he had no idea she was trained to dismantle opponents in the ring. The crystal chandeliers of the nocturne cast fractured light across faces that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Maya Bellini moved through the shadows of Manhattan's most exclusive club like smoke, invisible, necessary, forgotten the moment she passed. Her black uniform blended with the dark mahogany panels, her steps silent on Persian rugs that had witnessed more power exchanges than the stock market floor. The air hung thick with Cuban cigars and French cologne, punctuated by the soft clink of champagne flutes and murmurs in 3 languages. Maya's fingers traced the edge of serving trays with practiced precision, her eyes never lingering too long on any face, any conversation, any secret. In the nocturne, invisibility was survival, but tonight, survival would crack. Grant Romano had arrived from Chicago with the swagger of a man who confused aggression with authority. His voice carried across the main salon as he gestured wildly, bourbon sloshing in his crystal tumbler. "You see, the problem with this city," he announced to his circle of nervous listeners, "is that people forget their place." Maya felt his eyes find her before she saw him move. She was refilling water glasses at table 7 when his shadow fell across her path. The scent of expensive whiskey and cheap aftershave made her stomach tighten, not from fear, but from recognition. She'd smelled that particular combination of arrogance and insecurity in rings across 3 continents. "Excuse me, sweetheart." Grant's voice dripped false courtesy. His hand found her elbow, fingers pressing just hard enough to assert ownership. "You look familiar. Very familiar." Maya's training kicked in like muscle memory. Eyes down, posture neutral, voice steady. "I don't believe we've met, sir." The American accent rolled off her tongue smooth as silk, each syllable rehearsed until it became reflex. "Would you like me to refresh your drink?" Grant's grip tightened. The conversations around them began to fade as heads turned toward the disturbance. In the nocturne, even scandals were performed for an audience. "No, no, no!" Grant pulled her closer, his breath hot against her ear. "I never forget a face, especially one that belongs in places like, well, places that aren't as nice as this." The words hung in the air like smoke. Maya felt every eye in the salon turn toward them, felt the weight of judgment and curiosity pressing against her carefully constructed facade. Her free hand trembled, not from fear, but from the effort of keeping it from moving to Grant's pressure point. "Sir, I think there's been a mistake." "The only mistake," Grant interrupted, his voice rising to ensure maximum audience engagement, "is letting people like you pretend to be something they're not." Maya tried to step back, tried to fade into the shadows that had protected her for months, but Grant's grip was iron, and his performance was just beginning. He wanted humiliation. He wanted blood in the water. As she pulled away, her shoulder caught his elbow. The movement was small, barely noticeable, except for the arc of deep red wine that followed, splashing across the pristine white shirt of the man who owned every shadow Maya had ever hidden in, Adriano Ventresca. The salon didn't just go quiet. It crystallized. Ice formed in the air between heartbeats. Maya felt the weight of 50 pairs of eyes, felt the collective intake of breath that preceded either salvation or destruction. Adriano Ventresca stood 6 feet of controlled violence in a $15,000 suit. His gray eyes, the color of winter storms, traveled slowly from the wine stain on his chest to Grant's flushed face to Maya's carefully neutral expression. When he smiled, it was the kind of expression that made smart people reach for their lawyers. "Interesting," he said, his voice carrying the faint echo of Eastern European consonants wrapped in Ivy League polish. "It seems we have a problem." Maya felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. In trying to escape one predator, she'd stumbled directly into the territory of another, one infinitely more dangerous, because he had nothing to prove and everything to protect. Grant released her arm and stepped back, suddenly aware that he'd created a situation beyond his control. "Adriano, You were just what?" Adriano's tone remained conversational, but something primal flickered behind his eyes. "Teaching my staff proper respect. How thoughtful." The salon held its breath. Maya stood frozen between them, caught in a power play that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the wine spreading across silken pride. Adriano's gaze found hers, and in that moment, she saw something that made her trained instincts scream warnings. He wasn't angry about the wine. He was intrigued by her reaction to Grant. He was reading her the way she'd been trained to read opponents before putting them down. "Tell me," Adriano said, his voice soft as velvet and twice as dangerous, "what do you think would be an appropriate way to handle this accident?" Maya felt the trap closing around her. In the silence that followed, she realized that Grant Romano hadn't recognized her at all. He'd simply seen an easy target and decided to perform his dominance for the crowd. But now, standing in the crosshairs of Adriano Ventresca's attention, Maya understood she'd made a far more dangerous mistake. She'd made him curious. "Glad you're here. Leave a like, tell us in the comments what you thought, and shout out your city so we know where the crew is watching from." And now, back to the story. The Nocturne existed in the spaces between New York's official map and its hidden truths. Nestled 60 floors above the city, in a building that appeared on no tourist guide, it occupied the architectural equivalent of a state secret, visible only to those who already knew where to look. Maya had learned its geography through months of careful observation. The main salon sprawled across 3,000 square feet of polished obsidian and gold leaf, its ceiling a constellation of cameras disguised as decorative stars. Each table was positioned with mathematical precision, close enough for intimacy, far enough apart that conversations required intentional effort to overhear. The bar curved along the eastern wall like a crescent moon, its mirror backed with one-way glass that revealed nothing and reflected everything. But it was the sounds that truly defined the space. The whisper of Italian leather against mahogany chairs, the soft percussion of ice settling in crystal, the rustle of silk and cashmere as power dressed itself for the evening's performance. Conversations moved in layers, the public performance of industry small talk, floating above the private murmurs of real business, while underneath it all, the barely audible hum of recording equipment captured every word, for purposes nobody discussed. The smell was intoxicating in its complexity, sandalwood incense mixing with the metallic tang of expensive watches, the earthiness of aged whiskey fighting the sharp brightness of French perfume. But underneath it all, Maya had learned to detect something else. The faint scent of fear. Not panic or terror, but the careful anxiety of people who understood that every gesture was being evaluated, every word weighed for its potential consequences. Maya moved through this landscape with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned to survive by becoming wallpaper. The first rule was simple. Don't look. Not directly, not for more than the split second required to serve efficiently. Eye contact was invitation, and invitation was danger. Her gaze stayed fixed on surfaces, table edges, glass rims, the neutral territory of objects that couldn't stare back. The second rule was equally clear. Don't speak. Not beyond the scripted phrases of service, not in response to attempts at conversation, not even when silence felt more dangerous than words. Her voice was a tool with exactly 3 functions. Yes, sir. Right away. And my apologies. Everything else was territory she couldn't afford to explore. The third rule was perhaps the most important. Don't draw attention. No unnecessary movements, no distinctive gestures, no memorable quirks. She was Maya Bellini. Unremarkable and forgettable. A function rather than a person. Her uniform was pressed but not perfect. Her posture professional but not military. Her efficiency notable, but not exceptional. These rules had kept her alive for 7 months. 7 months of watching power exchange hands over cocktails, of witnessing deals that moved markets and destroyed lives, of serving men and women who traded in currencies that had no official exchange rates. 7 months of building an identity so thoroughly mundane that it became invisible. But as she stood in the center of the salon, with wine dripping from her fingers and Adriano Ventresca's grey eyes dissecting her like a medical examiner, Maya felt those 7 months of careful construction beginning to crack. The other staff members had already begun to fade into the background, following protocols that didn't include standing witness to potential executions. The guests maintained their positions, but shifted their attention, the way theater audiences focused when the real drama began. Even the ambient sounds seemed to quiet, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Maya could feel Adriano cataloguing details about her, the way she held her shoulders, the placement of her feet, the controlled rhythm of her breathing. He was reading her body language like a military strategist studying terrain, looking for the tells that would reveal what she was trying so desperately to hide. Grant Romano stood frozen in the space between them, suddenly aware that his performance had transformed into someone else's audition. The social predator, who had cornered her moments before, now looked like prey himself, caught in the crossfire of a much more dangerous game. The wine stain spread across Adriano's shirt like spilled blood, dark and damning against the pristine white silk, but his expression remained perfectly neutral, the kind of calm that preceded either forgiveness or annihilation. "The rules here are quite simple," Adriano said, his voice carrying easily across the silent salon. "Respect is earned through competence. Competence is demonstrated through performance. And performance," his smile was razor-thin, "is always evaluated." Maya felt the weight of evaluation settling over her like a shroud. In the space of 5 minutes, she had violated every rule that had kept her safe, drawn the attention she had spent months avoiding, and placed herself at the center of exactly the kind of spectacle that ended careers or lives. The Nocturne's hidden cameras continued their silent recording, and Maya realized that whatever happened next would be witnessed by far more people than those present in the room. Adriano Ventresca stepped closer, each movement calculated to compress the space around Maya until the air itself felt heavy with inevitability. The wine stain on his shirt seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, a red mark of transgression that demanded payment in ways that had nothing to do with dry cleaning. "You know," he said, his voice carrying the conversational tone of a man discussing the weather, "I've been coming to understand that accidents reveal character in ways that intentions never do." His grey eyes never left her face, studying each micro-expression like a chess master, evaluating an opponent's next move. "The question is, what exactly has tonight's accident revealed about you?" Maya felt the familiar tightness in her chest that preceded fight-or-flight responses, but forced herself to maintain the posture of submissive service. "I'm truly sorry about your shirt, Mr. Ventresca. If there's anything I can do to make this right." "Anything?" Adriano's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "How wonderfully open-ended. I do appreciate flexibility in my staff." Grant Romano shifted nervously in his peripheral vision, clearly regretting his role in creating this particular theater. The other guests maintained their careful positions, close enough to witness, but far enough to claim plausible deniability if questioned later. In the Nocturne, being a spectator was an art form that required precise distance management. "Tell me, Maya," Adriano continued, using her name like a scalpel, "how long have you worked here?" 7 months, sir." 7 months. He nodded, as if this confirmed something significant. "And in those 7 months, have you ever been curious about the basement?" The question landed like a physical blow. Maya had been aware of the basement's existence, freight elevators that descended below the main floor, staff members who returned from downstairs, with the particular exhaustion of people who had witnessed things they couldn't discuss. But curiosity about the basement was the kind of luxury that invisible people couldn't afford. "No, sir." "Honesty. I appreciate that." Adriano turned slightly, addressing his words to the room as much as to her. "You see, gentlemen, most people lie when they're afraid. But Maya here, Maya tells the truth even when it might be disadvantageous. That's either remarkable integrity or remarkable stupidity. The distinction hung in the air like smoke. Maya felt the trap closing around her with mathematical precision. Every answer led deeper into territory she couldn't navigate safely. Every silence was an admission of something she couldn't afford to admit. The basement, Adriano continued, is where we settle matters that can't be resolved through conventional means. Think of it as our private court of appeals, very exclusive, very final. His smile widened. And tonight, thanks to your unfortunate accident, you've earned an invitation to see it. Maya's training screamed warnings, but her cover demanded compliance. If that's what you think is appropriate, sir. What I think, Adriano said, moving close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and predatory, is that you've been pretending to be something you're not for 7 months. And I'm curious to see what happens when the pretense becomes inconvenient. He gestured toward the private elevator that served the basement levels. The doors opened with mechanical precision, revealing an interior lined with mirrors that would reflect every angle of whatever performance was about to unfold. Maya realized that even the elevator was a stage, designed to multiply the psychological pressure of descent. The rules are simple, Adriano explained as they stepped inside. 3 minutes in the ring with me. If you can demonstrate that you belong in this establishment, if you can prove that tonight's accident was truly just clumsiness, then we'll call the matter settled. His finger hovered over the button for the basement level. But if you reveal that you've been lying about who you are, well, we'll discuss appropriate consequences. Grant Romano stepped forward. Adriano, maybe this is what? Adriano's voice cut through the air like winter wind. Are you questioning my methods, Grant? Because I thought tonight's lesson was about respect and proper positioning. Grant's face flushed, but he stepped back into the safety of the crowd. Maya understood that whatever happened in the basement would be witnessed not just by those present, but by the network of cameras that documented everything for purposes nobody discussed. As the elevator began its descent, Adriano's reflections smiled back at her from all angles. You see, Maya, the beautiful thing about tests is that they reveal truth, regardless of intention. In 3 minutes, we'll both know exactly who you really are. The basement waited below them like an open mouth, and Maya realized that 7 months of careful invisibility was about to end in the most visible way possible. The game had begun, and she was about to discover whether her cover was strong enough to survive the kind of examination that left no secrets intact. The basement of the Nocturne revealed itself as a cathedral of controlled violence. Professional lighting illuminated a regulation boxing ring, surrounded by stadium seating that could accommodate 50 witnesses. The air carried the scent of leather and rosin, mixed with something sharper, the metallic tang of blood that had been cleaned, but never quite erased. Maya's uniform felt suddenly inadequate as she stood at the edge of the ring, watching Adriano remove his wine-stained shirt with movements that spoke of military precision. His torso told stories, scars that formed constellations across muscle, evidence of training that went far beyond civilian fitness. This wasn't the soft body of inherited wealth, this was weaponized anatomy. The rules remain beautifully simple, Adriano announced to the gathering crowd. Grant Romano had followed them down, along with a dozen other guests who moved with the hungry anticipation of people about to witness either sport or execution. 3 minutes, no weapons, no rules beyond basic survival. If Maya can prove she belongs upstairs, we'll consider tonight's unfortunate incident properly addressed. Maya stepped through the ropes, her hands shaking in what she hoped appeared to be terror rather than the effort of suppressing muscle memory. She stumbled slightly, a calculated piece of theater designed to reinforce the image of helpless service staff in over her head. Adriano moved into the ring like a predator entering his natural habitat. His stance was textbook Eastern European combat training, weight distributed perfectly, hands positioned for both offense and defense, eyes reading distance and angles with the precision of someone who had turned violence into science. "Begin," he said, and the word carried the weight of pronouncement. Maya's first instinct was to retreat, backing toward the ropes with the panicked movements of someone who had never seen combat outside of movies. Adriano followed with lazy confidence, throwing testing jabs that she avoided through what appeared to be desperate luck rather than skill. For 90 seconds, the performance was flawless. Maya stumbled, flinched, covered her face with amateur defensive postures that any first-day student would recognize as ineffective. The crowd settled into the comfortable rhythm of watching expected dominance, their attention beginning to drift toward the inevitable conclusion. But then Adriano made a mistake. His confidence bred carelessness, and he threw a right hook with enough power to end the demonstration early. The punch came fast and hard, aimed at her solar plexus, with the kind of precision that would drop most people without causing permanent damage. Maya's body responded before her mind could intervene. The evasion was perfect. A quarter step to the left that took her just outside the punch's arc, while positioning her inside Adriano's guard. Her right hand moved in a textbook counter-strike pattern, stopping just short of his exposed ribs. For a split second, she held the position that would have ended the fight with a single blow to his kidney. Then training reasserted itself, and she stumbled backward, making the movement look like accidental luck rather than professional technique. But it was too late. Adriano's grey eyes locked onto hers with the intensity of a sniper acquiring a target. The lazy confidence vanished, replaced by the focused attention of someone who had just realized he was no longer hunting prey. He was facing a predator in disguise. "Interesting," he murmured, circling her with renewed caution. "That was either remarkable luck or remarkable training. Which would you say it was, Maya?" Maya maintained her terrified expression, but she could feel the performance beginning to crack under his scrutiny. "I don't know what you mean, sir. I was just trying to get away." "Of course you were." Adriano's smile was sharp as winter moonlight. "And that step, that precise, efficient movement that put you in perfect position to break 3 of my ribs, that was just instinct?" The crowd sensed the shift in energy. What had begun as straightforward intimidation was transforming into something far more complex. Grant Romano leaned forward in his seat, suddenly aware that the evening's entertainment might not follow the script he had expected. Adriano feinted left, then right, testing Maya's reactions. Each movement was designed to probe for evidence of the training she was desperately trying to conceal. Maya forced herself to respond with amateur panic, but she could feel her body wanting to flow into combat patterns that had been drilled into her muscle memory through years of discipline and pain. "You know what I think?" Adriano said, his voice carrying easily across the basement. "I think you've been lying to us for 7 months. I think Maya Bellini is exactly as real as my wine stain will be permanent." He stepped closer, his presence filling the space between them like a physical force. "The question is, who are you really? And what exactly are you doing in my club?" The timer showed 90 seconds remaining, but Maya realized that the real test had just begun. The careful cover she had maintained for 7 months was unraveling under the relentless pressure of Adriano Ventresca's attention, and she was running out of ways to appear helpless while facing someone who clearly recognized competence when he saw it. The remaining 90 seconds stretched like hours under Adriano's predatory gaze. Maya felt the weight of scrutiny from every angle. The crowd above the ring, the hidden cameras she knew were recording, and most dangerously, the man circling her with the patient hunger of someone who had caught the scent of deception. "You're holding back," Adriano observed, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity that was somehow more threatening than anger. "That's what's fascinating about this moment. Most people in your position would be paralyzed by fear or adrenaline, but you're calculating." Maya forced herself to stumble again, letting her breathing become ragged in what she hoped appeared to be panic rather than the controlled respiration of someone managing combat stress. "Please, Mr. Ventresca, I just want to finish my shift and go home." "Home." Adriano repeated the word as if tasting something bitter. "Tell me about home, Maya. Where exactly does a woman with your particular reflexes call home?" The question was a trap wrapped in casual conversation. Any answer would provide data points for someone clearly skilled at reading people. Maya had rehearsed her backstory countless times, but under this pressure, even perfect lies felt transparent. "Queens," she said, choosing the most mundane truth possible. "I share an apartment with 2 other girls. We work different shifts, so we don't see each other much." "Queens." Adriano nodded thoughtfully. "And before Queen's, before this job that you perform so competently." Each word was weighted with meaning that went far beyond its surface. Maya realized he was probing for inconsistencies, looking for the gaps between her cover story and whatever truths her body language was betraying. "College," she lied smoothly. "Nursing program. I needed work while I finished my degree." It was a good lie, plausible, common enough to avoid suspicion, detailed enough to sound authentic, but as the words left her mouth, Maya saw something flicker behind Adriano's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or the satisfaction of someone who had just confirmed a suspicion. Nursing. His smile was sharp enough to draw blood. How wonderfully practical. I imagine that training teaches you to stay calm under pressure, to make quick decisions when people's lives hang in the balance. The timer showed 45 seconds remaining, but Maya understood that the real clock was the one measuring how long she could maintain this performance before her cover collapsed entirely. Adriano moved closer, forcing her to choose between retreat and engagement. Maya chose retreat, backing toward the ropes while maintaining the posture of someone who had never learned to fight. But each step felt like a betrayal of instincts that demanded she stand her ground and end this charade with the kind of violence she had been trained to deliver. "The beautiful thing about nursing," Adriano continued, his voice conversational despite the predatory intensity of his movement, "is that it teaches you to read people, vital signs, stress responses, the subtle changes that indicate when someone's body is preparing for trauma." He paused just outside striking distance. "I imagine you've become quite good at reading people, haven't you, Maya?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Maya felt the trap closing around her with mathematical precision. Every answer led deeper into dangerous territory. Every silence was its own form of admission. "I don't know what you mean," she said, but even to her own ears, the words sounded hollow. "Of course you don't." Adriano's laugh was winter cold. "Just like you don't know why your breathing never changed when I announced we were coming down here. Just like you don't know why you've been measuring distances and exit routes since we stepped into this ring. Just like you don't know why your hands haven't stopped moving in micro-adjustments that suggest you're fighting the urge to assume a proper fighting stance." Maya felt ice form in her stomach. 7 months of careful observation, and she had been careless for less than 3 minutes. But careless in ways that revealed training, preparation, the kind of awareness that peaceful civilians never developed. The timer reached 0, but neither of them moved to acknowledge it. The formal test was over, but the real examination was just beginning. "You know what I think happened tonight?" Adriano asked, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. "I think Grant Romano stumbled onto something he didn't understand. I think he recognized something in you that made him nervous, made him want to expose you before you could expose whatever secret he thought you might be carrying." His gray eyes never left her face. "The question is, was he right to be nervous?" Maya realized that the wine stain on his shirt had never been about humiliation or punishment. It had been an opportunity, a chance for Adriano to get her alone, to apply the kind of pressure that would crack even the most carefully constructed cover story. She was no longer Maya Bellini, invisible service worker. She was a puzzle that had captured the attention of one of the most dangerous men in Manhattan, and he had all the time in the world to solve her. The lights went out. Not the gradual dimming of planned ambience, but the sudden, complete darkness of severed power lines. Emergency lighting kicked in 3 seconds later, bathing the basement in hellish red that turned the boxing ring into something from a nightmare. The crowd's murmur of confusion died as the unmistakable sound of tactical boots echoed from the stairwells. Maya's body responded before her mind could process the threat. In the space between darkness and emergency light, she had assessed exits, counted footsteps, and identified the sound signature of military-grade equipment. Not police, too quiet, too coordinated. Not amateurs, the timing was too precise. "Everyone down." The voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Hands visible, no sudden movements. But Maya was already moving. While the crowd panicked and Adriano's security scrambled for protocols, she flowed toward the shadows with the fluid precision of someone who had survived situations like this before. Her civilian disguise became camouflage as she pressed against the basement's concrete walls, becoming invisible through stillness rather than movement. 4 figures descended the stairwell like mechanical spiders, black tactical gear, faces hidden behind masks that reflected the emergency lighting. They moved with the disciplined coordination of a unit that had rehearsed this exact scenario, their weapons sweeping the room in overlapping fields of fire that left no blind spots. The leader spoke with an accent that Maya recognized immediately, Eastern European, probably Czech or Slovak, the same linguistic region that had shaped her own carefully buried origins. "Grant Romano," the voice called out, echoing off concrete walls. "You have something that belongs to our employer. We're here to collect both you and it." Grant pressed himself against the far wall, his earlier swagger replaced by the kind of terror that came from recognizing mortal danger. "I don't know what you're talking about. This is a mistake." "No mistake." The leader's weapon trained on Grant's center mass. "You've been selling information about routes, schedules, personnel. Our employer is very disappointed." Maya felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. Grant's nervous energy at the club, his aggressive targeting of her, his apparent recognition. It hadn't been personal. He had been looking for threats, trying to expose anyone who might be gathering intelligence about the same networks he was apparently betraying. Adriano stood frozen in the center of the ring, his tactical mind clearly working through options that all led to the same conclusion. His basement had become a kill zone, and his guests were about to become casualties or witnesses, both equally dangerous outcomes. That's when Maya made her choice. The leader was focused on Grant, his attention narrowed by the tunnel vision that came with mission fixation. His team had positioned themselves to control the crowd, but they had made a critical error. They had dismissed the service staff as irrelevant. Maya moved like flowing water, using the emergency lighting's harsh shadows to mask her approach. Her hand found the main electrical panel that controlled the basement's systems, and in one fluid motion, she killed the emergency power entirely. True darkness fell like a curtain, and in that darkness Maya became what she had been trained to be. The sound of bodies hitting concrete echoed through the blackness. Not gunshots, but the precise impacts of pressure points and nerve clusters being targeted with surgical accuracy. Maya's training took over completely, muscle memory guiding her through movements she had practiced in complete darkness until they became instinctive. When the backup power finally restored minimal lighting, 2 of the tactical team were unconscious, their weapons secured. The leader and his remaining partner found themselves facing not a panicked crowd of civilians, but a woman who moved like violence itself. "Interesting," the leader said, his weapon now trained on Maya instead of Grant. "Nadia Vetrova. We wondered where you had disappeared to." The name hit the basement like a physical blow. Maya felt every eye in the room focus on her with laser intensity, felt 7 months of careful cover story crumbling in the space of 3 syllables. Adriano's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Nadia Vetrova. That's not a name one hears in casual conversation." Maya stood perfectly still, her civilian disguise now useless armor. The tactical leader smiled behind his mask, clearly pleased to have forced her revelation. "Oh yes," he continued, "Miss Vetrova has quite a reputation in certain circles. Ghost of the Eastern Circuits, they called her. Undefeated in 43 matches before she vanished." His weapon never wavered. "Our employer has been very curious about her whereabouts." Grant Romano's face went white as understanding crashed over him. "That's why you looked familiar. Jesus Christ, you're one of them." Maya realized that her careful months of invisibility hadn't just ended. They had exploded in the most visible way possible. Every person in that basement now knew exactly who she was and exactly how dangerous she could be. But more than that, they had heard her real name spoken aloud, and in the Nocturne's carefully recorded environment. That meant her identity was now permanently documented. The game had changed completely, and there was no going back. The tactical leader's weapon remained trained on Nadia as the basement settled into the kind of silence that preceded either negotiation or massacre. Around them, Adriano's guests pressed against the walls like frightened animals, suddenly aware that their evening of entertainment had transformed into something far more dangerous. The thing about ghosts, the leader continued, his accent thickening with what might have been satisfaction, is that they always leave traces. Footprints in Berlin, security footage in Prague. A very distinctive fighting style that certain people never forget. He tilted his head, studying Nadia with professional interest. Declan Kroll sends his regards. The name hit Nadia like ice water. Declan Kroll, trainer, handler, the man who had molded her into a weapon and then tried to own her completely. If he was involved, this wasn't just about Grant Romano's information selling. This was personal, and personal meant no survivors. Adriano stepped forward, his movement drawing the tactical team's attention. "Gentlemen, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. This is a private club, and you're disrupting my guests' evening." "Your guests," the leader replied, "are witnesses to a business transaction, unless you'd prefer they become something else." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Nadia could see Adriano's tactical mind working, calculating odds that all led to the same conclusion. His carefully controlled environment had been invaded by forces beyond his influence, and traditional solutions weren't available. That's when Nadia made her second choice of the evening. "Declan wants me alive," she said, her voice carrying the flat certainty of someone stating established fact. "Otherwise you would have opened with grenades instead of conversation." She took a half step toward the leader, close enough to be dangerous, far enough to avoid immediate retaliation. But alive doesn't mean undamaged, and it certainly doesn't mean cooperative. The leader's weapon tracked her movement. "You're assuming we need your cooperation." "I'm assuming you need to get out of this building alive," Nadia replied. "And right now, you're 60 floors above street level, in a structure that was designed to be a fortress. How exactly were you planning to extract with prisoners?" Adriano's eyes flicked between Nadia and the tactical team, clearly recognizing an opportunity when he saw one. "Ms. Vetrova raises an excellent point. The Nocturne security systems are comprehensive. Right now, every exit is being sealed, and response teams are positioning themselves in ways that will make your departure notably difficult." The leader's confidence wavered slightly. Professional operators understood the mathematics of tactical situations, and the numbers were beginning to shift against them. "However," Adriano continued, his voice taking on the persuasive tone of a man proposing a mutually beneficial arrangement, "I might be willing to facilitate your safe departure in exchange for leaving my property and my guests undisturbed." "And her?" The leader gestured toward Nadia. Adriano's smile was sharp as winter moonlight. "Ms. Vetrova has just demonstrated skills that could be useful in resolving this situation efficiently. I propose she comes with me, under my protection, while you and your employer reconsider your approach to collecting debts." Nadia felt the trap closing around her from a different angle. Adriano was offering protection, but protection always came with prices that weren't immediately apparent. Still, the alternative was Declan Kroll and whatever methods of persuasion he had developed since their last encounter. "You're proposing to shield a wanted asset," the leader observed. "I'm proposing to add a valuable resource to my organization," Adriano corrected. "Ms. Vetrova's reputation speaks for itself. Any employer would be fortunate to secure her services voluntarily, rather than through coercion." The mathematics were changing again. Nadia could see the leader calculating new variables: the cost of a prolonged siege versus the value of a single asset, the risk of escalation versus the certainty of Declan's displeasure if they returned empty-handed. "You stay under my protection," Adriano said quietly to Nadia, his words pitched low enough that only she could hear. "In exchange, you help me understand exactly what kind of war just landed in my basement." Nadia studied his face, reading the calculations behind his gray eyes. Protection meant obligation. Help meant exposure. But alone, she would be hunting ghosts while being hunted by them, a game where the house always won. "Done," she said. The leader's weapon lowered slightly. "This isn't over." "Of course not," Adriano agreed pleasantly. "But tonight's business is concluded. I suggest you use the service elevator. It bypasses most of our more aggressive security measures." As the tactical team withdrew, Nadia realized that her 7 months of careful invisibility had ended not just in exposure, but in partnership with one of the most dangerous men in Manhattan. She was no longer Maya Bellini, and she was no longer alone. But as Adriano's hand settled on her shoulder with possessive certainty, she wondered if protection might prove to be just another form of prison. The penthouse above the Nocturne felt like a different world. 30 floors of Manhattan skyline, stretching beyond floor-to-ceiling windows, the city's lights creating constellations that rivaled the stars. But Nadia barely noticed the view. Her attention was focused entirely on Adriano Ventresca as he moved through his private domain with the controlled grace of a predator surveying territory. "Drink?" he offered, gesturing toward a bar that probably cost more than most people's cars. The casual domesticity of the question felt surreal after the violence in the basement. "No, thank you." Nadia remained standing near the elevator, close enough to the exit to maintain the illusion of choice. She had traded one form of captivity for another, and the terms of this new arrangement were still being negotiated. Adriano poured himself 3 fingers of something amber and expensive, taking his time with rituals that seemed designed to let silence do the work of interrogation. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the conversational tone of someone discussing the weather. Nadia Vetrova, ghost of the Eastern circuits, undefeated in 43 matches before vanishing without explanation. He took a sip of his drink, studying her over the rim. "That's quite a career to abandon." "I didn't abandon it. I completed it." "Completed it?" Adriano smiled. "How wonderfully final. But completion usually implies some kind of closure, some resolution. From what I understand, you simply disappeared. Left contracts unfulfilled, debts unpaid, questions unanswered." Nadia felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with navigating conversations where every word was a potential trap. Sometimes the best conclusion is the one nobody sees coming. "True, but it's the aftermath that interests me." Adriano moved closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne mixed with the lingering adrenaline from their basement encounter. 7 months ago, Nadia Vetrova ceased to exist, and Maya Bellini appeared in my employ. 7 months of perfect service, perfect invisibility, perfect deception. The word landed like a physical blow. Nadia forced herself to maintain steady eye contact, reading his micro-expressions for signs of where this interrogation was heading. "The timeline is fascinating," Adriano continued. "Do you know what else happened 7 months ago? A very expensive operation in Belgrade went sideways. 3 high-value targets escaped custody during transport. Security footage showed a woman matching your description in the vicinity." His grey eyes never left her face. "Coincidence? Coincidences happen. They do, but rarely with such mathematical precision." Adriano set down his glass and moved to a wall display that held what appeared to be newspaper clippings, photographs, and documents connected by red string. A conspiracy theorist's dream made manifest with expensive materials. "Victor Stănescu. Does that name mean anything to you?" The name hit Nadia like ice water, but she forced her expression to remain neutral. Victor Stănescu, the man who had built the network that had destroyed her childhood, who had turned children into weapons and weapons into profit. The man she had spent 2 years tracking across 3 continents. "Should it?" "It should if you're the woman who killed him." Adriano's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Belgrade, 7 months ago. Professional execution, no witnesses, no evidence except for one detail. Stănescu's bodyguard survived long enough to describe his attacker, a woman who moved like water, who fought like she had been born in combat rings, who spoke to Stănescu in his native Romanian before putting him down." Nadia felt the walls closing in with mathematical precision. Every denial would sound hollow. Every admission would provide ammunition for whatever game Adriano was playing. "You're describing a fairy tale." "Am I?" "Because from where I'm standing it looks like I'm describing the woman who spent 7 months serving drinks to the same kind of men she used to hunt professionally." Adriano moved closer, his presence filling the space between them. "The question isn't whether you killed Victor Stănescu. The question is why you came here afterward. Maybe I needed a job. Maya Bellini needed a job. Nadia Vetrova needed something else entirely." His voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. "What are you really doing in my club?" The silence stretched between them like a blade. Nadia realized that Adriano had been studying her for far longer than tonight, that her carefully constructed cover had been transparent to someone who understood the mathematics of deception. "You want the truth?" she said finally. "The truth is that Victor Stănescu was a piece of a larger puzzle. He built networks, trained operatives, sold children to men who turned them into weapons. When I killed him, I inherited his records, names, locations, financial trails." She met his eyes directly. "And every single thread of that network passes through this city, through your world." Adriano's expression shifted, predatory curiosity transforming into something sharper, professional respect mixed with calculation. "You've been using my club to hunt my associates. I've been using your club to map the territory before I started hunting." Nadia felt the balance of power shifting as truth replaced performance. "But tonight changed everything. Declan Kroll knows where I am, which means the entire network knows. The hunting season just opened and I'm the prey." "Unless," Adriano said slowly, "you have a partner who understands the game." The partnership offer hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that would reshape everything. Nadia realized that her months of careful observation had been paralleled by his months of careful evaluation. The predator had been studying the hunter, and now they were negotiating terms for a collaboration that could destroy them both. The secure phone buzzed at 3:47 a.m., its encrypted signal cutting through the silence of Adriano's penthouse like a surgical blade. Nadia watched from the leather armchair where she'd been pretending to sleep, her body coiled with the tension of someone who never truly rested in unfamiliar territory. Adriano answered on the second ring, his voice carrying none of the grogginess that should have accompanied a middle-of-the-night call. "Nico. Nico Basile, Adriano's head of security, the man who had built the Nocturne's defensive systems from the ground up." Nadia had studied him during her months of observation, cataloguing his patterns, his protocols, his unwavering loyalty to the man who had rescued him from a Sicilian blood feud years earlier. "Boss?" Nico's voice was tight with urgency that even the encrypted connection couldn't disguise. "We've got problems. Big ones." Adriano's expression shifted into combat readiness. "Talk to me. The basement footage from tonight, it's gone." "Gone how?" "Professionally gone. Not deleted, extracted. Someone with administrative access pulled the files at 2:15 a.m., 30 minutes before the automatic backup to external servers. Whoever did this knew our security architecture better than our own IT team." Nadia felt ice form in her stomach, the footage of her real identity being revealed, of her combat skills being displayed, of her partnership with Adriano being negotiated, all of it evidence that could be weaponized against them both. "Inside job," Adriano said, his voice flat with certainty. "Has to be. But here's the thing, boss. The access logs show my credentials. Someone used my security codes to authorize the extraction." The silence that followed was pregnant with implications. Nadia watched Adriano's face transform as he processed the mathematics of betrayal. Someone in his inner circle hadn't just sold information, they had framed his most trusted lieutenant in the process. "Where are you now?" Adriano asked. "Safe house in Queens." "But boss, there's more. I've been monitoring our communication channels since the basement incident, and there's been chatter. Financial transfers, coded messages, meeting arrangements. Someone's been preparing for tonight for weeks." Nadia rose from the chair, moving close enough to hear both sides of the conversation. The tactical implications were cascading. If someone had been planning tonight's assault, then Grant Romano's betrayal was just one piece of a larger operation. "Who else has administrative access?" she asked quietly. Adriano's eyes met hers as he considered the question. "Besides Nico and myself, Marcus Webb, my financial coordinator, Sophia Chen, who handles legal affairs, and," his expression darkened, "Don Alessio Barone." The last name hung in the air like a death sentence. Don Alessio Barone, Adriano's silent partner, the man whose old-world connections had helped establish the Nocturne as neutral ground for New York's shadow elite. A partnership born of mutual necessity, but maintained through careful balance of power. "Boss," Nico's voice carried through the phone, "there's something else. I've been tracking financial movements through our subsidiary accounts, Someone's been bleeding money from the Nocturne's operations for months, small amounts hidden in operational expenses, disguised as legitimate costs. How much? Close to 2 million. Maybe more. Adriano's jaw tightened as he absorbed the scope of the betrayal. Enough to fund a hostile takeover, or enough to buy serious muscle, Nadia added. She had seen the economics of mercenary operations before. Professional tactical teams didn't come cheap, and Declan Kroll's involvement suggested resources that went far beyond simple revenge. Nico, I need you to stay dark for now. Don't trust anyone, don't use any of our usual communication channels. We'll make contact through secondary protocols in 12 hours. Copy that, boss. But watch yourself. Whoever's behind this, they've been playing chess while we were playing checkers. The call ended, leaving them in silence that felt heavier than the Manhattan night pressing against the windows. Nadia watched Adriano process the implications, saw him rebuilding his mental map of trust and suspicion. Don Alessio, she said finally, tell me about him. Old school, Sicilian blood but Brooklyn raised. Built his reputation on never breaking his word and never forgetting a slight. Adriano moved to the window, staring out at the city lights as if they might contain answers. We've been partners for 3 years. He provided the connections. I provided the vision. It's been profitable for both of us. Until now. Adriano turned back to face her, his grey eyes hard as winter steel. The question is whether he's the architect or just another piece being moved around the board. Nadia felt the familiar rush of tactical analysis, her mind automatically sorting possibilities into probabilities. Either way, he's the key. If he's betraying you, we need to know why and how deep it goes. If he's being manipulated, we need to know by whom and for what purpose. We? The word carried weight that went beyond simple partnership. Nadia realized that somewhere between the basement and this moment, she had stopped thinking of this as Adriano's problem and started thinking of it as their problem. The footage that was stolen shows me killing 2 trained operatives in complete darkness. That makes me either a valuable asset or a dangerous liability, depending on who's watching. She met his eyes directly. Right now, your survival and mine are mathematically linked. Adriano's smile was sharp as a blade. Then I suggest we start doing the math. Outside the windows, Manhattan stretched toward dawn, unaware that a war was beginning in the spaces between its official boundaries. And in the penthouse above the Nocturne, 2 predators began planning their hunt. The emergency board meeting convened at dawn in the Nocturne's private conference room, 40 floors above the chaos of Manhattan's morning rush. But the chaos inside the mahogany-paneled chamber was far more dangerous than anything happening on the streets below. Don Alessio Barone sat at the head of the polished table like a judge presiding over an execution. His weathered hands, decorated with rings that told stories of old-world power, rested calmly on documents that could destroy everything Adriano had built. Around him, the Nocturne's board of silent partners waited with the hungry patience of vultures sensing carrion. The security breach last evening, Don Alessio's voice carried the weight of years and the promise of consequences, has created what we might call a crisis of confidence. Adriano stood near the windows, his back to the room, watching the city wake up below. Nadia recognized the posture, a tactical position that kept his face unreadable while maintaining visual control of all exits. She remained in the shadows by the door, officially present as security consultation, unofficially calculating the room's dynamics with the precision of someone who had learned to read power the way others read weather patterns. Confidence, Adriano repeated without turning around. An interesting choice of words, considering that the breach originated from someone with administrative access to our most secure systems. Indeed, Don Alessio's smile was thin as paper and twice as sharp, which raises uncomfortable questions about your vetting procedures, your security protocols, and your judgment regarding personnel decisions. Every eye in the room flicked toward Nadia. She felt their assessment like physical weight. These men who traded in information and influence, trying to determine whether she represented opportunity or threat. Marcus Webb, the financial coordinator whose nervous energy had always set Nadia's instincts on edge, leaned forward with documents spread before him like tarot cards. The numbers don't lie, Adriano. Last night's incident has triggered breach of contract clauses with 3 of our most significant clients. We're looking at immediate losses in excess of $8 million. Plus, added Sophia Chen, her legal training evident in every precisely chosen word, potential liability exposure. If our client's confidentiality has been compromised, the lawsuits alone could destroy us. Don Alessio nodded gravely. Which brings us to the central question. Can we trust you to protect our collective interests, or has your judgment become compromised by personal considerations? The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Nadia understood that this wasn't really about security breaches or financial losses. This was a carefully orchestrated coup designed to remove Adriano from power while appearing to address legitimate concerns. That's when she noticed the detail that changed everything. Marcus Webb's documents were spread across the table in neat stacks, financial reports and breach assessments arranged with obsessive precision. But the paper clips holding them together were positioned in a pattern that made Nadia's trained mind snap to attention, a code she had seen before in safe houses and dead drops across Eastern Europe. The positioning wasn't random. It was a message. Nadia moved closer to the table, ostensibly to pour water from the crystal pitcher, but actually to read the pattern more clearly. 3 clips angled northeast, 2 southeast, 1 due north, coordinates disguised as office organization. Don Alessio, she said quietly, her voice cutting through the board's deliberations like a surgical blade. May I ask when you first became aware of the security vulnerabilities Mr. Webb has documented so thoroughly? Don Alessio's eyes sharpened. Ms. Vetrova, while we appreciate your expertise, this is a matter for the board to resolve. Of course, but as someone with experience in operational security, I'm curious about the timeline. Nadia moved to the window beside Adriano, positioning herself where she could see both the room and his reflection. These documents suggest surveillance and analysis that would have taken weeks to compile, which means the security assessment began well before last night's incident. Marcus Webb shifted uncomfortably. Standard precautionary measures. We routinely assess— No, Nadia interrupted, her voice carrying the flat certainty of someone stating mathematical facts. These aren't routine assessments. These are preparation documents for a hostile takeover, compiled by someone with intimate knowledge of the Nocturne's vulnerabilities and positioned to exploit them systematically. She moved to the table and, with movements too quick for anyone to prevent, rearranged Marcus's paper clips into their actual pattern, a series of coordinates that pointed to specific locations in Manhattan. Marcus has been using office supplies to communicate with external parties for months. The pattern changes with each meeting, but the methodology is consistent. It's a technique taught to deep cover operatives who need to pass information in plain sight. The room went dead silent. Don Alessio's weathered face transformed as he processed the implications, his old-world instincts recognizing betrayal when it was presented with mathematical precision. Marcus Webb's face went white, then red, then white again. That's completely ridiculous. You're seeing patterns where none exist. Am I? Nadia's smile was sharp as winter moonlight. Then you won't mind explaining why these coordinates correspond exactly to the locations where Declan Kroll's operatives have established surveillance positions around the city. Adriano turned from the window, his grey eyes locked onto Marcus with predatory intensity. How exactly would you know Declan Kroll's operational patterns, Marcus? The question hung in the air like a blade. Marcus looked around the table, seeking support from allies who were suddenly studying their hands with intense fascination. I think, Don Alessio said slowly, we may have identified our security breach. Sophia Chen was already reaching for her phone. I'm calling building security. No need, Adriano said, his voice carrying the controlled calm that preceded violence. Marcus is going to explain everything voluntarily. Aren't you, Marcus? The financial coordinator's composure cracked like glass under pressure. You don't understand. They have my daughter. Declan Kroll has my daughter, and he said if I didn't provide intelligence about your operations, he'd what? Nadia asked quietly. He'd sell her to the same networks that bought you. The admission hit the room like a physical blow. Nadia felt something shift in her chest. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition of the mathematics that turned ordinary people into weapons against their will. Don Alessio's expression transformed from suspicion to something approaching respect as he looked at Nadia. "Ms. Vetrova, it appears we owe you a considerable debt." "No," Adriano said, his voice carrying a note of finality that reshaped the entire room's power dynamic. "What we have is a partner whose skills complement our weaknesses perfectly." Nadia felt the balance of the relationship shift in real time. She was no longer the rescued asset or the protected investment. She was the tactical intelligence that had just prevented a complete organizational collapse. The partnership was no longer about survival. It was about winning. The video went viral at 11:47 a.m., not the carefully edited security footage from the Nocturne's basement that remained locked in digital vaults that even governments struggled to crack. This was something far more damaging. Cell phone footage from one of the guests, shaky and pixelated, but clear enough to show Nadia Vetrova moving through tactical operatives like death incarnate. Adriano watched the view counterclimb from his penthouse office, each refresh adding thousands of witnesses to what should have been a contained incident. The video had been posted anonymously to multiple platforms simultaneously, tagged with keywords that ensured maximum visibility. In Nocturne Fight, Nadia Vetrova. In Ghost of the East, Corporate Violence, Manhattan Secrets. 47 million views in 6 hours, Sophia Chen reported, her legal training evident in the way she delivered catastrophic news with professional detachment. It's trending on every major platform. The FBI's Digital Crimes Unit has already issued preservation notices to the hosting sites. Nadia stood at the window, watching media vans gathering in the street 60 floors below like antibodies responding to infection. Her reflection in the glass looked like a ghost, pale, insubstantial, caught between worlds she could no longer safely inhabit. "The federal interest isn't just about the violence," she said quietly. Victor Stănescu's files contained information about trafficking networks that crossed state lines. If they connect me to his death, this becomes a RICO investigation. Don Alessio Barone sat heavily in the leather chair that had become his throne during crisis management, his weathered hands folded over documents that grew more damaging by the hour. The clientele is fleeing like rats from a sinking ship. 3 major contracts cancelled this morning, 5 more suspended pending security review. We're hemorrhaging reputation faster than we can staunch the bleeding. The morning had brought a cascade of consequences that no amount of planning could have prevented. Marcus Webb's confession had revealed the scope of Declan Kroll's intelligence operation. Months of surveillance, financial manipulation, and strategic positioning designed to destroy the Nocturne from within. But the viral video had accomplished in hours what Kroll's careful planning had failed to achieve in months. "The problem," Adriano said, his voice carrying the flat exhaustion of a general watching his army disintegrate, "isn't the federal attention, it's the market reaction." He gestured toward the wall display that showed real-time financial data flowing like digital blood. The Nocturne's shadow economy operated through layers of legitimate businesses, each one now facing the kind of scrutiny that killed profits and exposed vulnerabilities. Stock prices for our shell corporations down 30%, banking relationships under review, insurance policies suspended pending investigation. Sophia's voice remained professionally neutral, but her hands shook slightly as she turned pages. "We're looking at complete operational shutdown within 72 hours. Nadia felt the weight of responsibility settling over her like lead. Her decision to reveal her skills had saved lives, but it had also destroyed the careful ecosystem that had protected them all. The mathematics were brutal in their simplicity. Visibility equaled vulnerability, and vulnerability equaled death in worlds where discretion was survival. "There's more," Don Alessio said, his voice carrying the gravity of someone delivering terminal diagnoses. "I've been contacted by representatives of families who've done business here for decades. They're concerned about their exposure." The euphemism landed like a physical blow. When old-world families expressed concern, it usually preceded solutions that involved shallow graves and missing persons reports. "How concerned?" Adriano asked. concerned enough to suggest that the problem might be personal rather than institutional. They're willing to preserve the nocturne's reputation if the source of contamination can be isolated and removed. Every eye in the room turned toward Nadia. She felt their assessment like a physical weight, felt the careful alliance of the morning transforming into the brutal calculus of survival. "They want me," she said, her voice steady despite the ice forming in her chest. "They want the problem solved," Don Alessio corrected. "How it gets solved is still negotiable." Adriano moved to his desk, his movements carrying the controlled tension of someone operating under enormous pressure. He opened a secure drawer and removed a series of photographs, surveillance shots taken from multiple angles, showing figures in tactical gear moving through urban environments. "While we've been dealing with media crisis," he said, spreading the photos across the mahogany surface, "Declan Kroll has been positioning assets throughout the city. Sniper teams, extraction units, surveillance specialists. He's turning Manhattan into a hunting ground." Nadia studied the photographs, her trained eye cataloging equipment, positioning, tactical advantages. Professional military contractors, not the kind of muscle you hire for simple debt collection. No. This is the kind of muscle you hire when you want to send a message to an entire industry. Adriano's grey eyes met hers across the desk. The message being, this is what happens when you interfere with established networks. The silence that followed was pregnant with implications. Nadia understood that her partnership with Adriano had evolved beyond mutual benefit. It had become mutual destruction. Her presence in his world was a contamination that threatened everything he had built. "I can leave," she said quietly. "Disappear again. Find another identity, another city, another life." "You could," Adriano agreed. "But Kroll's operation isn't about capturing you anymore. It's about demonstrating dominance. He'll hunt you across continents if necessary, leaving bodies in every city until he makes his point, which is that networks like Victor Stănescu's are under new management, that freelance operators like you are either assets or liabilities, with no middle ground." Adriano gathered the photographs, his movements precise and deliberate. "Running won't solve this. It will just change the hunting ground." Don Alessio cleared his throat, the sound carrying the weight of decades in shadow economies. "There is an alternative approach." The room held its breath as the old man continued. "Dalia Rizzi arrived in the city this morning. She's taken a suite at the plaza, made reservations at establishments that cater to our particular clientele. She's not here for tourism." Nadia felt ice form in her stomach. Dalia Rizzi, Kroll's enforcement specialist, the woman who had earned her reputation by making torture into performance art. If she was in New York, the stakes had escalated beyond simple business disputes. "She's here to collect me personally," Nadia said. "She's here to make an example," Adriano corrected. "The question is whether we're going to let her write the ending to this story, or whether we're going to take control of the narrative ourselves." The partnership that had formed in desperation was about to be tested by the kind of pressure that destroyed everything, except the most essential elements. Nadia realized that survival now depended not on running or hiding, but on transformation, becoming something that couldn't be hunted because it had learned to hunt back. Outside the windows, Manhattan continued its relentless motion, unaware that a war was being declared in the spaces between its official boundaries. And in the penthouse above the Nocturne, two predators began planning not just their survival, but their evolution. The abandoned warehouse in Queens felt like hallowed ground to Nadia. Concrete floors stained with years of honest sweat, heavy bags hanging like sleeping giants, the sharp scent of leather and determination that marked places where people transformed pain into power. Marco Greco's underground academy had been her sanctuary during the first terrifying weeks after escaping Victor Stănescu's network, the place where she had learned to channel survival instincts into something approaching hope. Now, watching Adriano Ventresca struggle through basic defensive formations, Nadia felt the strange satisfaction of watching absolute power encounter absolute limitation. "Your stance is still wrong," she said, her voice carrying the flat authority of someone who had learned these lessons through pain rather than theory. "You're fighting like someone who expects to win through intimidation." That's not combat. That's performance. Adriano straightened, sweat darkening his expensive workout clothes, his grey eyes carrying frustration that would have been dangerous to express in any other context. I've had military training. You've had officer training, Nadia corrected, circling him with the predatory patience of someone conducting an examination. Leadership courses, strategic planning, maybe some ceremonial sword work, but you've never had to fight someone who was trained to kill you specifically. The distinction hung in the air like smoke. Marco Greco watched from the corner, his scarred hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The old trainer had seen enough broken people walk through his doors to recognize the difference between teaching technique and rebuilding souls. "Show me again," Nadia commanded. "The escape from a rear choke." Adriano moved behind her, his arms encircling her neck in the textbook application of a blood choke. For most people, this would be the moment of panic, the desperate struggle against superior strength and position. For Nadia, it was an opportunity to demonstrate the mathematics of violence. She dropped her weight, twisted left, and drove her elbow into the space where Adriano's ribs would have been if she had wanted to puncture his lung. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds and left him sprawled on the concrete, staring up at her with the kind of respect that came from understanding exactly how close to death he had been. "Again," she said, "but this time, stop thinking like someone who gives orders and start thinking like someone who follows them." The lesson continued for another hour, each repetition designed to strip away layers of assumption and privilege that had insulated Adriano from the brutal realities that Nadia had learned to navigate. She watched him transform, not into a fighter necessarily, but into someone who understood that survival required humility. "The problem with power," Nadia explained during a water break, "is that it creates the illusion of control. You've spent years believing that influence could solve any problem, that resources could overcome any obstacle. But there are situations where none of that matters." Adriano toweled sweat from his face, his movements carrying the careful exhaustion of someone who had discovered muscles he didn't know he possessed. Like being hunted by professional killers. Like being hunted by anyone with better training and less to lose. Nadia moved to the windows that overlooked the industrial landscape of Queens, watching for surveillance that probably wasn't there, but checking anyway because paranoia was another form of training. "The networks you've been operating in, they're built on mutual benefit and calculated risk, but the world I come from operates on different mathematics. Which are, survival is the only currency that matters, and everything else is negotiable." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Marco Greco cleared his throat from his corner, drawing their attention with movements that spoke of old injuries and older wisdom. "You two finished with the philosophy lesson?" he asked, his voice carrying the dry humor of someone who had seen too much to be impressed by anything. "Because we've got practical problems that need practical solutions." He gestured toward a tablet displaying news feeds from across the city. The morning's viral video had spawned a media feeding frenzy that showed no signs of abating. Camera crews stalked the entrances to buildings associated with the nocturne. Federal agents had been spotted in the financial district. The shadow economy that had operated in careful invisibility was being dragged into daylight with surgical precision. "Dalia Rizzi made contact with our friend Marcus Webb 3 hours ago," Marco continued. "They had lunch at a very public restaurant, very visible, very much designed to send a message." Nadia felt ice form in her stomach. "She's using him as bait." "She's using him as a demonstration," Adriano corrected, his tactical mind processing implications with newfound clarity. "Showing that she can reach anyone, anywhere, any time she chooses." Marco nodded grimly. Webb's daughter was returned to him this morning, alive, unharmed, but with a very specific message. His cooperation bought her freedom, but continued loyalty to certain parties might not preserve it. The message was clear enough to read from space. Dalia Rizzi wasn't just hunting Nadia. She was systematically dismantling every support structure, every alliance, every relationship that might provide sanctuary or assistance. "There's more," Marco added, his voice dropping to the tone reserved for terminal diagnoses. "Word on the street is that there's a bounty. Not just for you, for anyone providing assistance, shelter, or information that might help you evade capture." Nadia turned from the window, her reflection multiplied in the industrial glass like fragments of a broken mirror. How much? $10 million, dead or alive, but preferably alive for what they call educational purposes. The number hung in the air like a death sentence. $10 million was enough to turn friends into enemies, allies into hunters, sanctuaries into traps. It was the kind of money that made loyalty a luxury most people couldn't afford. "So we're alone," Adriano said. "No." Nadia's voice carried the flat certainty of someone stating mathematical facts. "We're focused. There's a difference." She moved to the center of the training area, her posture shifting into something that made both men instinctively step back. This wasn't Nadia the fugitive or Nadia the partner. This was Nadia the weapon, fully activated and operational. "Here's what's going to happen," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned to command through competence rather than position. "We're going to stop reacting to Dahlia's moves and start making her react to ours. But we do this my way, with my rules, using methods that she understands but can't predict." Adriano nodded slowly. "What do you need?" "I need you to stop thinking like a businessman and start thinking like a soldier. I need Marco to provide equipment and tactical support without asking questions about legality or consequences, and I need both of you to understand that once we start this, there's no retreat, no negotiation, no mercy." The partnership that had begun in desperation was crystallizing into something harder and more dangerous. Nadia realized that she was no longer asking for protection or offering assistance. She was taking command of a war that would determine not just their survival, but the entire future of the networks they represented. "One more thing," she added, meeting Adriano's eyes directly. "If this goes wrong, if I'm captured or killed, you walk away. No rescue attempts, no revenge missions, no guilt. You rebuild your organization, and you forget I ever existed." Adriano's smile was sharp as winter steel. "And if it goes right?" "If it goes right," Nadia replied, "we rewrite the rules for everyone." The nocturne at midnight looked like a mausoleum dressed for a funeral. Emergency lighting cast harsh shadows across empty tables where power had once been traded like currency. While outside the windows, media vans maintained their vigil like electronic vultures waiting for carrion. But 60 floors above the abandoned main salon, a different kind of gathering was taking place. Don Alessio Barone had arrived with Dahlia Rizzi at his side, their entrance choreographed with the precision of a hostile takeover. The old man's weathered hands rested on documents that would transfer ownership of the nocturne to parties unknown, while Dahlia's presence served as both enforcement and insurance against complications. "Adriano," Don Alessio's voice carried the gravity of someone delivering last rites, "I want you to understand that this brings me no pleasure, but the organization requires stability, and stability requires difficult decisions." Adriano sat in his executive chair with the composed calm of someone who had already accepted defeat. His expensive suit was impeccable, his posture relaxed, his expression carrying the kind of resignation that came with understanding when games were truly over. "I appreciate your position, Alessio," he replied, his voice carrying none of the defiance that might have been expected. "The nocturne has become a liability that exceeds its value." Dahlia Rizzi moved through the office like a predator cataloging territory, her pale eyes taking inventory of everything that would soon belong to her employer. She was smaller than her reputation suggested, but carried herself with the controlled violence of someone who had learned to make intimidation into performance art. "Where is she?" Dahlia asked, her accented English carrying the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. "The ghost who has caused so much disruption." "Gone." Adriano gestured toward the windows that overlooked Manhattan's glittering sprawl. "Vanished the same way she appeared. We haven't had contact since the federal investigation began." The lie was delivered with perfect conviction, supported by documentary evidence that Marco Greco had spent days creating. Security footage showing Nadia leaving the building alone, financial records indicating the termination of her employment, witness statements confirming her departure, all carefully constructed to support the narrative of abandonment and betrayal. Don Alessio reviewed the documents with the thoroughness of someone whose survival had always depended on attention to detail. These federal interest. It will fade once the subject is no longer associated with our operations. Exactly. Adriano's smile was thin as winter light. Distance equals safety, for all of us. But Dahlia's expression suggested that she wasn't entirely convinced by the performance. Her pale eyes studied the office's details with professional suspicion, looking for the inconsistencies that would reveal deception. "You seem remarkably calm for someone losing everything," she observed. "I'm a businessman," Adriano replied. "I understand when a position becomes untenable and requires strategic withdrawal." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, covering transfer procedures, asset valuations, and timeline for operational changes. But underneath the corporate language, everyone in the room understood they were negotiating the terms of an execution that had been dressed as a business transaction. That's when the lights went out. Not the gradual dimming of system failure, but the sudden, complete darkness of deliberately severed connections. Emergency power should have activated within seconds, but the backup systems remained silent, leaving them in the absolute blackness that preceded either rescue or annihilation. Dahlia's voice cut through the darkness with trained calm. "Professional work. Motion sensors indicate 4 entry points, coordinated timing, electronic warfare capability." "Federal?" Don Alessio asked. "No. Federal raids announce themselves. This is something else." The emergency lighting finally activated, but instead of the expected red glow, it cast everything in stark white illumination that made the office look like a medical examination room. And in that harsh light, they saw what the darkness had concealed. Every surface in the office was covered with photographs, not random images, but carefully selected documentation of every illegal transaction, every compromising meeting, every criminal association that Don Alessio Baroni had accumulated over decades in shadow economies. Financial records showing money laundering operations, surveillance photos of meetings with known traffickers, audio transcription of conversations that federal prosecutors would classify as conspiracy evidence. "What is this?" Don Alessio's voice carried the kind of rage that preceded violence. "This," said a voice from the shadows, "is what accountability looks like." Nadia emerged from concealment with movements that seemed to bend light around her. She wore tactical black that made her nearly invisible against the office's dark surfaces, but her face was clearly visible in the emergency lighting, calm, professional, absolutely without mercy. "Surprised?" she asked conversationally. "You shouldn't be. Professional intelligence gathering was always part of my skill set." Dahlia's hand moved toward her concealed weapon, but stopped when Nadia shook her head with the kind of patience reserved for instructing children. "I wouldn't. The building is currently under complete electronic surveillance by parties who have been very interested in your employer's activities. Every movement, every word, every breath is being recorded by people who understand the value of evidence." Don Alessio's weathered face went white as he processed the implications. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Nadia gestured toward the windows, where the media vans that had been maintaining vigil were suddenly joined by unmarked federal vehicles. "FBI Financial Crimes Unit, DEA International Trafficking Division, Treasury Organized Crime Task Force. They've been investigating the networks Victor Stănescu documented for months, but lacked the evidence to proceed." She moved to Adriano's desk and opened a secure drawer, revealing recording equipment that had been documenting everything for the past 20 minutes. Until now. The mathematics of the situation crystallized with brutal clarity. Don Alessio had walked into a carefully constructed trap, documenting his criminal associations, while federal agents gathered evidence that would support prosecution under RICO statutes. His attempt to eliminate threats had become a confession that would destroy him. "You have exactly 30 seconds, Nadia continued. "Oh, make a choice. You can attempt to salvage this situation through violence, in which case you'll be arrested for assault in addition to everything else. Or you can sign the documents that transfer all claims on the nocturne back to Mr. Ventresca, after which you'll have approximately 6 hours to leave the country before federal warrants are issued." Dahlia Rizzi smiled with genuine appreciation. "Professional work. Declan will be impressed." "Tell Declan," Nadia replied, "that the accounts are settled. Victor Stănescu's network is documented, his associates are exposed, and his victims have justice. The hunting season is over. Don Alessio's hand trembled as he signed the transfer documents, his decades of carefully constructed power crumbling in the space of minutes. As federal agents entered the building below, he understood that his empire was ending, not with violence, but with the kind of bureaucratic precision that left no room for appeal or negotiation. The war was over before it had truly begun, decided not by superior firepower, but by superior intelligence and the patience to let enemies destroy themselves through their own arrogance. In the harsh light of the emergency systems, Nadia Vetrova stood revealed not as the hunted, but as the hunter who had been playing chess while everyone else struggled with checkers. 6 months later, the Nocturne reopened its doors to a carefully curated guest list that understood the new rules of engagement. Gone were the theatrical displays of dominance and the underground spectacles that had once defined Manhattan's shadow elite. In their place was something more refined, a collaboration between legitimate business and tactical intelligence that operated with surgical precision rather than brutal intimidation. Nadia stood at the main salon's center, no longer invisible in black service uniforms, but commanding attention in a tailored charcoal suit that spoke of authority earned rather than inherited. Her hair was shorter now, styled with the kind of professional precision that made her past as Maya Bellini seem like a fever dream. But her eyes remained the same, alert, calculating, constantly reading the room's dynamics with the skills that had kept her alive in far more dangerous environments. "The quarterly reports," she said, addressing the assembled board with the confidence of someone who had learned to transform survival instincts into strategic thinking, "show a 40% increase in profitability over the previous year. Turns out that discretion and competence generate better returns than fear and spectacle." Adriano Ventresca sat at the far end of the mahogany table, his grey eyes carrying the kind of respect that came from understanding exactly how close to destruction they had all come. The man who had once commanded through inherited privilege now deferred to expertise that had been forged in combat zones and perfected through necessity. "The federal investigation concluded 3 weeks ago," Sophia Chen reported, her legal training evident in the precise delivery of information that could have destroyed them all. "All charges against associated parties have been dropped in exchange for cooperation in dismantling the trafficking networks documented in Victor Stănescu's files." The transformation had been gradual but complete. The Nocturne's new structure operated like a precision instrument. Intelligence gathering, strategic consultation, and risk assessment for clients who understood that survival in modern shadow economies required adaptability rather than tradition. Nico Basile had returned from his exile in Queens, but the experience had changed him. His security protocols now emphasized prevention over punishment, intelligence over intimidation. The scars from Don Alessio's betrayal had taught him to value loyalty that was chosen rather than inherited. "Speaking of cooperation," Nico added, his voice carrying the dry humor of someone who had learned to find amusement in survival, "we received a very interesting proposal this morning." He slid a document across the table toward Nadia, his expression suggesting that the contents would be either amusing or alarming. Nadia scanned the formal letterhead, her eyebrows rising as she processed the implications. "The Department of Homeland Security," she said, her voice carrying genuine surprise, "wants to offer me a consulting contract." "Apparently," Adriano observed, "your work in documenting and dismantling Victor Stănescu's network has attracted attention from people who deal in national security rather than corporate security." The offer was substantial. Enough money to buy independence, enough legitimacy to erase the shadows that had defined her past, enough official protection to make her untouchable by the kind of forces that had once hunted her across continents. "Interesting," Nadia mused, setting the document aside with the kind of casual dismissal that suggested it had never been a serious consideration. "But I have other commitments." Marco Greco entered the salon with movements that spoke of old injuries and older wisdom, his scarred hands carrying a tablet that displayed news feeds from across the globe. The underground trainer had become their intelligence coordinator, monitoring networks and threats with the patient thoroughness of someone who understood that vigilance was the price of survival. The networks are fragmenting, he reported, setting the tablet where everyone could see the data streams that tracked criminal organizations across 3 continents. Without Stănescu's central coordination, without Don Alessio's financial infrastructure, the trafficking operations are collapsing into smaller, less effective units. Nadia studied the displays, her tactical mind automatically processing patterns and implications. Good. Smaller units are easier to track, easier to infiltrate, easier to destroy when necessary. Which brings us, Adriano said, to the question of what exactly we're building here. The question hung in the air like smoke. Around the table they represented something unprecedented, a fusion of legitimate business acumen and combat-tested operational capability, of inherited privilege and earned expertise, of traditional power structures and revolutionary methodology. "We're building something that can't be hunted," Nadia replied, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had learned to think in terms of permanent solutions rather than temporary fixes. A network that exists in the spaces between legitimate and illegitimate, that provides services that governments can't offer and corporations can't deliver. She moved to the windows that overlooked Manhattan's evening skyline, watching the city transform as darkness brought out different kinds of illumination. The view was the same one she had contemplated as Maya Bellini, but everything else had changed. Victor Stănescu built his empire by turning children into weapons. Declan Kroll maintained it by turning weapons into slaves. Don Alessio tried to inherit it by turning slaves into commodities. She turned back to face the room, her expression carrying the kind of finality that marked the end of one story and the beginning of another. "We're going to do something different." "Which is?" Sophia asked. "We're going to turn weapons into choices." The mission statement was both simple and revolutionary. The Nocturne's new incarnation would identify, train and deploy individuals with tactical capabilities for purposes that served justice rather than profit, stability rather than chaos, protection rather than exploitation. "The networks Victor built will be rebuilt," Nadia continued, "but under management that understands the difference between using people and empowering them." As the meeting concluded and the board members departed into Manhattan's night, Nadia remained at the windows, watching the city pulse with the kind of energy that never truly slept. Adriano joined her there, 2 figures silhouetted against the urban constellation. "No regrets?" he asked. "About which part? Destroying my cover, starting a war, or refusing legitimate employment with federal benefits?" "About staying visible." Nadia considered the question with the thoroughness it deserved. Visibility had always been vulnerability, exposure had always meant danger. But invisibility had also meant isolation, powerlessness, the constant fear that came with having no allies and no sanctuary. "Maya Bellini was safe," she said finally, "but she was also dead in every way that mattered. Nadia Vetrova is dangerous, but she's also alive." The partnership that had begun in desperation had evolved into something unprecedented, a collaboration between equals who had chosen each other rather than being forced together by circumstances. They were no longer predator and prey, or protector and protected, or even partners in mutual survival. They were architects of a new kind of power, one that operated through competence rather than inheritance, through choice rather than coercion, through transformation rather than destruction. In the window's reflection, Nadia saw not the ghost she had once been, but the woman she had chosen to become, visible, vulnerable, and finally completely free. If today's story got you hooked, subscribe right now for the next one. Drop a like and comment.